Hi, everyone. I'm Andres Nescu, and I'm a professor over in Montreal, Canada. I teach at a university level about how to study games, communication, and especially card games. And I've been peeking around Riftbound a lot after years of playing Legends of Runeterra and about 30 years of playing Magic. And I'm seeing a lot of questions on the subreddit pertaining to, how to approach the game, how to build decks, and how to really take a crack at a game, especially from people who've never played TCGs before. And one of the questions that I've seen pop a lot over the subreddit, even today, is how to build a deck, period. Now, below in the video description, you can find a link to the Riot Games post on how to just build a deck at a mechanical level, which is really about which cards do you put in and how do you build a theme. And I find that guide to be pretty approachable, but I figure that there's a deeper discussion you can have about how to build a deck and start approaching card game concepts and like how to evaluate cards in a vacuum, how to evaluate them in a meta. Now, if you're watching this, there's a high chance that you've come across the videos talking about Kaisa decks and Master Yi decks and Aurora decks, which are all very strong, and you can certainly pick up lists from the Shanghai Open or that are floating around YouTube channels. That's not really what this video is about. This video is really about how to think through the game in a way that's going to pay dividends in the long term, I think. So, the first thing that I would recommend reconsidering when you're asking, how do I build a deck or how do I build X hero, is to really reframe it as a question about how do you want to win. And to answer these kind of questions, you really want to think through, what are your goals in the game, what kind of tools you want to use to meet those goals, and whether or not you have any aesthetic preferences. I know a lot of people, myself included, really like certain heroes and would like to play with them, and that doesn't always lead to the most meta decks. That said, you can probably find solid success at your local Nexus nights or even with friends, and that's not really going to match tournament results from high level competitive play, at least not yet. Partially because people don't have all the cards in hand, and also because a lot of those decks are prone to misplays if you don't know how to play the game at that level yet. So, secondary questions that you should ask yourself are, do you like playing fast or slow game plans? Which means like playing a lot early or holding energy and runes for spells that are going to come later. The other is, do you prefer to conquer or hold? Riftbound is actually pretty interesting in that you can play aggressive conquer and aggressive hold builds, as well as more defensive conquer and hold builds. So it doesn't really map onto traditional card game discussions about aggressive or controlling strategies. Do you like spells or creatures? This is going to matter somewhat for certain heroes. And the last and more complicated question, which I'll be talking about for the rest of the video, is, do you prefer something like straightforward offensive strategies, combos, or controlling the game? These archetypes are usually run through 4 kinds of cards that you're going to have to compose your deck with. First up is the legend, which is really going to determine your colors, the signature spells that you use, or cards, if you're thinking about like Annie, and whether or not you have access to a persistent mechanic or something that leads to like strong blowouts. Then from that legend, you're going to be able to pick one of 2 champions, at least at the time of this recording. And that's going to further cement your sub strategy and really allow you to think through a sort of strategy that you can access every game or almost every game. And I did forget that read more tab there when I was making the slides. The rest is really going to be the main deck cards that are going to support the strategy that you're trying to run through your Legend and Champion, with some exceptions that I'll talk about. Notably, Aurora and Baited Hook are probably more important than the Champion is in those kinds of decks. And then the battlefields, which support your overall strategy, and you get access to one of 3 of them depending on which mode you're playing. All of these are going to mesh onto sort of a card game triangle that's been kind of tried and true for most card games that I've seen in my life. This is really like an updated take on one that was floating around Legends of Runeterra about 4 years ago, but there's been equal kinds of versions in Magic the Gathering. And this really posits like a triangle of aggro, control, and combo. So aggro meaning aggressive strategies, control meaning controlling strategies, and combo meaning combo heavy or like interlocking combinations of cards. And generally what happens is aggro tends to be combo, combo tends to be control, and control tends to be aggro. Within this, there is something called mid-range, which is sort of a half and half approach between aggressive and controlling decks, which will give up the strengths of both, but have less of the weaknesses as well. And there are some other more niche combinations that I'm not going to talk about today, like combo control is sometimes called prison control. I don't think that the game currently has the kinds of cards that would support that kind of strategy, but it is useful to note. These sort of card archetypes are really instantiations of the bar that you see at the bottom of the screen between tempo and value. And these are terms that you're likely to see when you're studying card games in general or you're trying to figure out what kind of decks you want to build. Tempo often is about the pace that you're playing at. And so in some games, there is actually like an archetype called tempo, which is between aggro and mid-range. But in general, it really is about like the pace of play. And tempo is about assertive plays that dictate what that pace is going to be. So in this case, tempo means pressuring for early points and especially pressuring fields in a way that will make it increasingly hard for your opponent to dislodge you from them. Value, on the other hand, is really about accruing as much card advantage or strength in the cards that you have on the field, sometimes at the risk of losing some early points or even losing some cards in your hand. It really is about, optimizing resources and really kind of outgrinding your opponents. So value tends to be really concentrated in control, and aggro really tends to dominate with tempo. Combo works a bit differently in that it kind of has a little bit of both, but it really is playing its own game plan, so I'll talk about it in a second. So aggro. Aggro in most games really refers to ending the game as soon as possible by killing your opponents when you have life totals. Obviously in Riftbound, that's not the case. You want to hit 8 points as fast as possible. So you're more likely to find strategies that can conquer and hold early and exert pressure on that point total, often taking points as soon as early turn 2. Especially if you're the first player, you can assert pretty heavily, and you want to compress as much power in those early plays. So you're not trying to really fight at that 8+ energy cost bracket. You're trying to really fight at the 2 to 4 energy bracket. And you're trying to end before your opponents can really stabilize and start playing big units and big spells. Now, aggro contains both units like Noxus Hopeful, and I think Legion is like a pretty good example of compressing value into early plays. But there are also spells, and spells can be used both in controlling and aggressive manners, in this case, killing your opponent's units more often than not. Control, I think, is really sort of exemplified by Dazzling Aurora, and we can talk about it in a second. It can also control, hold, and conquer fields, but it will do so later in the game, and often in a way where once it sort of gets on point, it'll never leave again. Whereas aggro will have a tendency to conquer and then maybe retreat and conquer again. You're also looking to drain opponents of resources, so cards like Sabotage and Mind Splitter are also like pretty on point for this. And you're likely to accept some point losses early, just so that you can develop your units in base and really, just overwhelm opponents with value. So Dazzling Aurora is a really good example of this because effectively you really just want to get to 9 energy and sack those 2 runes so that then you can start playing ginormous units that your opponents can never trade into profitably. So it's not that those units will never die, but it is that they will often take 2 to 3 cards from your opponent to interact with, and by that point they'll be starved of resources and you'll just eke out the win. And lastly, combo and Riftbound. Combo is a pretty tricky topic to cover this early in the meta. Combo tends to maximize bursts of advantage at specific points in time. In games like Magic, you'll often see sort of sequences that will completely lock opponents out of play. That's not really available in Riftbound right now, but there are certain cards that will accelerate the game plan at specific junctures, and they're usually marked by requiring multiple pieces to function properly. So I think the example I would give is Yasuo Windrider, which requires you to move him 3 times in one turn to score a point, which will always require the use of Yasuo Windrider himself, the use of your legend, and probably a third card. Sometimes even 2 spells can sort of do this, or 3 spells might do this on an opponent's turn. So the idea is that you will find a very precise moment to score more points than you would normally be able to and close out the game at an inopportune moment. You're probably going to be slower than aggro decks, but you are going to sort of surprise control decks. Right now, purple doesn't seem like the strongest color, and the sort of, purple version of Yasuo is not the one that is dominating tournaments. Not the Windrider version, but there is like a control shell that is working quite fine. So the reason why these archetypes are important, other than like being families of kinds of decks that you want to play, is that they tend to defeat certain kinds of decks because of the pace that they like engineering in the game. So aggro will almost always crush combo if it's incredibly well tuned, because combo will be looking for its game pieces and really fumble the ball early on. Combo will beat out control by effectively locking in slightly earlier than control and really just making it impossible for control to ever like get on board again, or will just like eke out a win very suddenly. And control will often just remove aggro units or really slow down your pace of play until they start overwhelming you with resources. And in Riftbound, this is actually somewhat inevitable because you're getting energy at a reasonable pace every turn, and the heroes that are really good in control decks currently are not necessarily burning through runes all that much. So you can count on the fact that you will accelerate your game plan consistently, which is not always the case in games like Magic the Gathering. Another concept that I would like to talk about really quickly is relative speed. So relative speed is really about figuring out whether you're the aggressor or you're the defender in most matchups, and also how you would like to engineer your deck to produce those kinds of matchups. So in general, it's a good idea to be much faster or slightly slower. So take, for example, Faithful Manufacturer, either a turn 1 second player play or a turn 2 play. Often you'd love to see this if you're playing something like Darius or if you're playing Viktor. And you can play this at the end of turn 1 and immediately take 2 fields at the start of turn 2 and start pushing. Now, if you are somebody who's playing like the movement style Yasuo combo deck, you're likely on Kain Unleashed. And Kain Unleashed will sort of start locking people out of fields and clearing the way for your Yasuo to move in and take points. But they won't be able to do that super fast. They're probably playing it 1 to 2 turns later than you, and then they have to move it in and expend cards. So you are playing much faster as Faithful Manufacturer, and you're happy to like lose a unit or 2 by that point, and you'll have scored a lot of points, or perhaps even locked out the game. However, if you're stuck in something like a mirror match, or you're playing a Darius deck, suddenly Vanguard Captain, which requires a little bit more setup, will have more value than you by a slight amount, but will also only be slightly slower. So yes, you will score a point or 2, but then you'll be overtaken by Vanguard Captain, and it'll become increasingly costly for you to stay on that point. So in this kind of scenario, the Vanguard Captain player, whether they're playing a Darius or they're playing Lux or Viktor into whatever you're playing, will be slightly slower than you. And I think this is one of the hardest concepts to grasp in the moment, which is sort of on the fly figuring out at that moment who is the aggressor and who is the defender and how you should play. Now, I mentioned mid-range earlier, and a way to understand mid-range is not necessarily exclusively by thinking of those three speeds, but really thinking about mid-range as a philosophy of play, where you're actively reducing your top end and your speed so that you will take mid-game engagements much better than other decks. So for example, if you are in sort of a Kaisa very dominated meta, the best thing you could do would be to play a slightly slower Kaisa where you would give up some of the conquer points early, but you would just have like more tools to deal with your opponent. This is also likely where you're seeing a lot of variants of Master Yi at different speeds, and people are trying to figure out, what's the fastest and what's the slowest way you can play Yi, and what do they lose to. And this is why you're also seeing some different versions of Viktor, either incredibly go wide versions or versions that are playing Cruel Patron and Spectral Matron. So there's a lot of like different speeds to consider. And heroes can be played at different tempos based on what champion, or legends can be played at different tempos based on what champions you're picking. So again, the question you should ask yourself is, are you interested in something like aggro, like combo, like control, or do you want mid-range, which is a bit more of an all-arounder, but is maybe not as favored into any matchup per se. So as a really quick review for the, approaching like this more advanced version of how to build a deck, you should really just ask, like these three questions. So who do you want to play? You can start with a legend, or how do you want to play? Which will, select certain kinds of packages of cards, either fast or slow. These questions are interchangeable. I tend to prefer thinking about legends because that's the dominant paradigm of the game right now. But if I had a set of, for example, 3 baited hook, I would start thinking about what legends I would like to play with baited hook. And same thing if you're somebody who really wants to play Dazzling Aurora, you can start thinking, well, do I want to play Master Yi Aurora, Misfortune Aurora, or even Volibear Aurora? So there are like different ways to approach the problem. I just tend to favor this one. And lastly, the sort of subsequent question that you should ask is, okay, well, if my deck has these weaknesses, how can I avoid losing the game? And that will lead you in one of two directions. So either you're going to want to diversify with cards that supplement your strategy and the weaknesses that you have, which will almost always turn you into a mid-rangey version of whatever concept you're thinking. Or you can accentuate your archetypes features by making it very fast or very slow, or even putting in more combo enabler pieces. And that will usually tend to increase your margins against decks that you were already favored into, and reduce your margins against decks that you are weak against. So something to consider. For example, Master Yi adding Dazzling Auroras made it much better into Kaisa, but it made it much worse into Viktor, as far as I know from tournament play. So the next thing that I want to do is sort of an exercise, because these are concepts that are, kind of wide-ranging, and feel free to ask questions in the video comments, but I figure it's kind of easier to think through how to build these kinds of decks if you're doing it. I really want to caveat this by saying I'm not building for like meta. I'm building to showcase the concepts of how you would build. And meta decks often will utilize these concepts at the highest level, but will keep tuning against a tournament meta. And at this point, I'm actually not that confident that the dominant decks will stay dominant for the next couple of weeks. The Shanghai National just happened, which had about 2,000 players. 2,000 players playing, somewhere on an average of 4 to 5 rounds is about 8,000 to 10,000 matches. That's actually not a lot of data. For people who come from Legends of Runeterra, there have been times where dominant decks have had something like 80,000 matches parsed, and the meta would shift pretty radically when people found solutions to problems. So I would recommend building for strategies that you like to play and becoming really good at those strategies before you start venturing into meta decks proper. And what I want to do is I want to give you 3 examples of how to build for aggro, for combo, and for control. The way that I would start this, and I mentioned that, we're going to start with aggro first. I'm going to start with Viktor. And the reason why I picked Viktor is primarily because Viktor is one of the starter decks, which some people are getting their hands on, and I think he has like a pretty linear game plan that you can get used to. So I'm using Piltover Archive, which I think is fantastic. It allows you to curate your deck collections, see other people's decks, and also have like your entire card roster. So we're picking Viktor, and Viktor's ability is pay 1, exhaust him to generate 1 recruit during your turn. And we have to pick a Viktor champion to go with that selection. So you have 2 options. You have Viktor Innovator and Viktor Leader. Viktor Leader is pretty dominant right now, and I think I'm going to go that direction, but I'll talk about the 2 choices. So Viktor Innovator lets you play recruits or generate recruits when you play spells during your opponent's turn. If you pick Viktor Innovator, it will telegraph to your opponent that you will be looking to play spells constantly on their turn, and not all of the removal spells and not all of the token generation spells are great for that. So I tend to like it a little bit less. Viktor Leader, I think, is a bit stronger for 2 reasons, and I would assume that the community agrees given the tournament dominance of the 1 copy of Viktor Leader. It makes trading with other units a pretty miserable affair, and he just generates a wide number of units every turn, every game, depending on how you're engaging. And he's also slightly higher power. So we'll pick a Viktor Leader. And then I'm going to try to keep this somewhat budget. But what we're really looking for is anything that makes recruits or that will interact with them pretty well. So we like Faithful Manufacturer, and we definitely like Vanguard Captain. Both produce a decent amount of units. And then I tend to also like Machine Evangel, which is a bit more expensive, so I'll only put 2 copies in. So what we've done now is we've introduced, out of 40 playable cards, your selected champion being 1, we've introduced 9 cards that are dedicated to going wide, which Viktor will supplement. Now, another sort of what we call bucket or package of cards that you would want to have in here would be anything that kills units. So because you know that you will almost certainly always be generating more units than your opponent, or an equal amount, you would like to play Call the Weak reasonably in 3 copies. Call the Weak is incredibly cheap, and it also only has the downside of sacrificing 1 of your units, which you love. And for the same reason, I would also play Hidden Blade. The reason why I would play Hidden Blade, you're going to be on point a lot. You are the aggressive deck, so you can hide it reasonably well, which will make it cheap. And you can kill enemy units when you're about to win. The card draw doesn't matter as much, especially if you're pressuring early. They can have 15 cards in hand, but if they can't play them, then it doesn't really matter. And if you are sort of playing the slower version of this, you can also kill your own units in response to removal, so that you will be able to generate some more value, or eke out more card draw as much as possible. I also like Cruel Patron for the same reason. So we're starting to go into sort of a kill your own unit package. 2 copies for now, I think, is quite fine. And I would also include 2 copies of Imperial Decree. You assign combat damage however you would like, and you have a lot of it going around, so you can usually kill much larger units with your 1 cost units as well. So we're up to like 18 cards already. I also like 1 copy of Salvage. There's a lot of strong gear going around, especially Aurora. If you're ever stuck in an Aurora matchup, having access to Salvage is pretty brutal for the opponent. Not every Aurora deck is green. So, for example, MF Aurora and Volibear Aurora can't really deal with Salvage in the way that E Aurora can. So already, it's starting to look fairly good. You can also look up some damage spells, and if you have access to the Proving Grounds box, you will have some copies of Singularity. Singularity, I think, is just like a good value damage spell. Allows you to deal 6 damage to 2 units. And at this point, you're starting to look at about 8 removal spells, which is about 1/5 of the deck. I'm happy with about this much. And then you can start looking at what is available in your colors that you would like to play. Again, we're building for, hyper cheap versions of this deck. And I think that what you're interested in is not really expending too much money until you're sure you want to play with this deck. Siphon Power is a fantastic card, but we'll forgo it for a second. And what I would like to recommend instead is to play the one copy. Whoa. Did I actually add it? The one copy of Heimerdinger Inventor, which will give you a second instance of Viktor's activated ability. And then you know that you're going to be the one generating an enormous amount of units constantly. So you want to start capitalizing on that to close the game. So 2 things that you can do. I would highly recommend playing Spectral Matron 3 times. You're playing a very high density, like low power unit deck where you're sacrificing your own units for some amount of value. Spectral Matron's great. You can replay it. You can play it and replay units from your graveyard like Vanguard Sergeant. So that's pretty fantastic, and you will be like getting value out of it for sure. And you probably want 2 copies of Grand Stratagem. The general rule of thumb for when you want 2 or 3 copies of a unit really has to do with whether or not drawing a second or third copy of that spell feels terrible. I think drawing 1 Grand Stratagem is generally good if you're not drawing it super early or on an empty board. I think a second Grand Stratagem gets iffy, but I like having 2 to draw 1 reliably. I think adding a third copy of Grand Stratagem and potentially drawing into 2 or 3 Grand Stratagems absolutely KOs your game plan, and you can't really afford to go that way. And then you're not really playing for this mana level. So then we go back and we revise the deck a little bit. We're at 27 cards, and what we know is that we would like some card draw. So Stupefy is generally quite reasonable to play and accessible for most people. It will swing combats your way, and it'll replace itself as card draw. And then, I did forget to put in 1 copy of Commander Ledros, who I like due to his deflect against Kaisa decks. An 8-power unit that makes it really hard to actually, not get to go through with it, with spells. Obviously, there are a bunch of like really strong units like Thousand-Tailed Watcher and the spells that you get access to, which are also reasonable, like Divine Judgment. I am sticking away from them, but if you have them, feel free to include. The other aspect of this that you should maybe consider is Seal of Unity. Once you hit enough of a rune cost, you might notice that there is some amount. You are the aggressive deck, so you are happy playing for all of these sort of like rune burn situations. Another aspect that you kind of like as an aggressive deck is having 3 of Daring Poro, just like a really solid, cheap unit that you're happy to trade off and get some points early on. And then I think I would recommend probably, how many units are we at here? So we're at main deck 35. 3, 6, 7, 10, 12, 15, 17, 18 units. I feel like the deck is slightly light on units, and I would want more recruits, since that is what we will be doing the most with. Noxian Drummer, I'm not the biggest fan of, but you can quite easily play a couple of copies, and it will do the work until you're more settled. And at that point, I'm going to recommend some How are we doing on card draw? We are slightly low on card draw, for sure. And Viktor is less affected because you can generate your own recruits, but you would like to have some more of it. And so I think what I'll do is I'm going to put in 3 Watchful Sentries. You're probably going to be sacrificing a fair amount of these to the Cruel Patron, or the Ladros, or the Call to Weeks. So you have some amount of, like, mileage out of these. I'm gonna take out 1 Noxian Drummer and up the Cruel Patrons by 1. Cruel Patrons is just like a great card. It's overstated and undercosted. And then what we need is battlefields and runes. So you're trying to go wide and you're trying to conquer and end the game as soon as possible. So what we would like are Altar to Unity, which will create recruits for you as you hold and force your opponent to trade into you, which is fantastic. You also want Trifarian War Camp, which will almost certainly always benefit you more than your opponents. And then the other aspect of this that I would recommend would be Arena's Greatest. You are the aggressive deck. You are looking to end the game earlier than your opponents that are going late. But there are some other options relative to this. For the same reason, I would recommend Aspirant's Climb if you're on the other end of this. And then I'm almost certainly going to bork this, but you can count your rune symbols. So 1, 2, 5, 8, 11, 13, 19, and 23 yellow to 4, 5, 5 blue. So for now, you can select to not slant your runes too much, but you are definitely leaning yellow. And I would recommend a 7-5 split almost certainly, because a lot of your early yellow... Did I mess something up? Oh, we're 1 card over. I'm going to cut 1 more Noxian Drummer. And then that's sort of like approaching a reasonable starter shell for like local events and fun for, like starting out. So name this like Viktor starter. Make this public. Save deck. So that's 1. And next, we're going to move on to the combo Yasuo version. Or actually, I'm gonna move towards the control Misfortune. Let's do this instead. So Misfortune, I think, is somewhat in the cheaper colors by being in purple, but orange can get very expensive. And so this version is not going to be as cheap as the Viktor version, certainly, by virtue of you having to get certain cards. So the first thing you want to see as a controller is, what kind of Misfortune champion can I get? So you can either get Misfortune Buccaneer, which allows you to play to open fields, or you can get Misfortune Captain, which will allow you to ready units and to start ping-ponging between, also have Accelerate and Ganking. Accelerate on a 5-cost unit effectively makes it a 6-cost unit with 2 Rune Burn. That's not really an aggressive unit in my play, in my book. It's really more of a controlling unit that you play in the mid-range to sort of stabilize. So I would personally pick Misfortune Captain. And then you're going to be playing to keep fields as open as possible and to clear them. I think one of the best tools currently to do that is Warwick. And Warwick is something like $1 US right now. Warwick enters readied, same as your MF, and he can kill damaged units wherever he lands. So what you're looking for is damage. You want cards that will deal damage and that will sort of clear the field. Now, bullet time is exceptional. If you get a version of it, if you get a copy of it, play it. If you get 2 copies, play it. If you get a 3rd copy, put it in the sideboard. I would like almost always recommend that these be part of your rotation. And then, so it's written as deal. I just need to find the proper wording. So you want 3 Flurry of Blades and 3 Cannon Barrages. Now, the way Warwick works with these kinds of interactions is once you attack with Warwick, he will check what units are at the field with him and who has taken damage. So Cannon Barrage, you're going to have to cast it after you enter with Warwick, and he will also take the 2 damage. Or you can precast for Flurry of Blades and deal damage to all units at battlefields. Now, obviously, one of the things that you want to be doing with Warwick in this case is you also want to be moving him. So there are a couple of cards that you will really like moving. And I think 1-2 copies of Anivia are also very good in this kind of deck. So you're going to be looking at some move spells to sort of get you along the way. Ride the Wind is kind of incredible. You can, for example, move Warwick on an opponent's turn quite easily as an action during a showdown, and it will ready him, and Warwick will be able to do some shenanigans, which is always great. You can also move him on your turn. So I personally really like it. I also love Fight or Flight for the same reason, because Fight or Flight will let you save your Warwick, but it will also let you push back units that are stuck in unfavorable conditions. So already you've got some like pretty good hold the ground plays with these cards. And then what I think really makes a controlling MF build kind of shine are cards like Sabotage, which I would want 3 of, and effectively allows you to just like shred your opponent's hand. If you are the controlling player, you're burning some runes, you kind of don't care. You can really take out your opponent's proactive plays and force them to play on top decks. And for that same reason, I would play Mind Splitter on the back end, probably only 2 copies. This is the closest you can get to a discard shell, and something that will really starve your opponent. So use damaging spells to really clear low to the ground threats, and then you use some stronger removal or these big units to just like make your opponent's discard. And already we're at 22. We need to short up about 17 other cards. I would include 2 Gust. Gust is also good, but it's a bit more prone to being powered through by other people. And then I think 2 Morbid Return to get units back. And then what you would like, in a world where you have access to more budget, I would recommend going on the Stack Deck, Mystic Poro, and Nocturne package. But we're going to be, playing a little bit less with that right now. So I would recommend something like Traveling Merchant. Card Advantage still works as a form of value. Then 2 Rebukes to keep returning opponents' units to their battlefield. And 3 Sneaky Deckhands to sort of just get on the play and sneak out some points when you get a chance. we are now at 34, so there's 5 more cards to fill in. Warwick has ganking and is very much, part of the package. How do I build this? I think card draw is just too essential in a Misfortune build. Also, MF gives ganking to units. Not that Warwick... Oh, Warwick doesn't have it, but he will get it from the hero. So you can move him from one field to another. So what do we have for card draw? I think in that case, I would probably recommend something like 1 Catalyst of Aeons to accelerate into your Anivia, and then probably just 1 more Anivia, 1 more Mind Splitter, 37. I feel like this deck is a bit too top heavy for units. So I think I would want First Mates. Just as cheap units that you can get down on the field. And then this deck is also going to be somewhat lighter on runes. So 3 orange, 6 orange, 9, and 15. And then for purple, it's 6, 10, 13, 13. So 15, 13. I think I would just play this with an equal split in terms of battlefields. So just those. And for battlefields, you are in the controlling build, so you want to starve your opponent of resources and not have them win. So Aspirant's Climb, I think, is fantastic. For certain, Crow of the Godwillow, you want to draw people into engagements on battlefields so that Yorick can come in and clean up, but also so that you can target your removal spells out there. And then... I think you would be happy to pick up... You're not targeting your own unit. Well, you are targeting your own units, but not as much as you would like. Probably Vile Mauslayer. This makes aggressive units commit really strongly, and you can gank out a Vile Mauslayer, but they can't, which will allow you to like set up some plays. So again, not the most competitive deck, but certainly like a somewhat more accessible MF shell than the Aurora version. Roll MF. I think this deck is more expensive than the regular, than the other deck, but still only about 25 euro. I think really the card that's driving up the price is Sabotage. And I think the rest is like accessible for like $30. Yeah. And then for the third deck, we're going to go for Yasuo. And Yasuo is a hero that I'm building for myself a fair amount of. And the combo heavy version of Yasuo really wants the game to end suddenly, so he's playing slightly aggressively compared to other heroes. So I'm most certainly trying to get the game to end fast. So I want Arena's Greatest. And I also want to be moving around a lot. So Windswept Hillock is fantastic. And then probably for the last one, I think I would pick Dreaming Tree or Zon. I want to be conquering a lot, I want to be moving a lot, and I want the game to end quickly. I also want to clear terrains as much as possible. So the Yasuos that I'm picking, spoiler, will be all of them. They're reasonably cheap, but your chosen champion is almost certainly going to be Yasuo Remorseful, and you want a triple dose of Yasuo Windrider, and you want to find him and move him as much as possible. Notably, you can move Yasuo Windrider on your opponent's turns and score. It's just a lot harder because you can't activate your champion's, your Legend's ability, but it is doable. However, it's quite easy to start a turn, score twice, and then move Yasuo 3 times to score the winning point. This can make a game end in about 3 turns, or 4, depending on how quickly you're going. So evidently, you want cards that move cards as much as possible. Triple Charm, Triple Ride the Wind for certain, Double Tide Turner, Triple Fight or Flight, and maybe 1 Flash, which is a bit more restrained. This is a very spell-heavy deck, so you're already this high. You also want to be protecting Yasuo as much as possible. Sonya's is very good, but it's, I think, a bit above the price range I would want for this. So what I want is double Defy and double Wind Wall as counterspells. Crucially, you're using these to protect your unit at key points in the game. And then you really want to find your Yasuos. So I would recommend getting a set of stacked decks almost assuredly, and I would then pick up Triple Mystic Poro and 2 copies of Nocturne and 2 copies of Kane. This will set up your plays to become very aggressive very quickly. This is already like a 26 card deck. You love having Triple Discipline for the draw. You love Double Meditation, and On Guards are also very easy to pick. Double Gust to control the battlefield a little bit more. And Find Your Center, which is less useful in this kind of build than it is in a hyper controlling build, but you're already like scoring a lot of protection. So between the On Guards, the Disciplines, and like the other 2 versions of control that you can sort of load into this, I really like it. I really like having like another draw that you can sort of sneak in a win maybe. Now, your Yasuos are going to die. It's going to happen almost certainly, and I think you want probably like 1 copy of a unit that can also power through some of those like mid builds. You're not going to win against an Aurora deck. Well, one exception if you want to win against an Aurora deck is packing Mystic Removal, which allows you to... actually, it doesn't. It's a spell. So you can't... I actually think you can't really win into Aurora unless there's a Gear Destruction in purple-green, which I don't think there is. If it ever loads. I think it might just... Yeah, there is none. So... Oh, actually, you can just pack 1 copy of Acceptable Losses. So you're not really playing gear, your opponent is. And... Oh, that's actually like more, because it's using this. So... I would cut 1 flash if you don't have... the Proving Grounds box set. That's 41. I want to be down to 39. That's still like way too much. I think Gust is a bit weaker, a bit more prone to being disrupted. Yeah, and I think that works. So that's 39 cards. Same thing. You do your rune count. No. So 2 green, 5 green, 9 green, and then 2, 4, 7, 7 purple. So really not a problem either way. And you just go half and half. And you're kind of okay. What are we missing? Missing 1 card. Oh, it already counted the Yasuo. I counted poorly. At this point, it's really like a dealer's choice. I think I'll just go back to one more Find Your Center. It's like a very consistent deck. So these are, reasonably easy to put together decks. I think the Yasuo deck is like even cheaper than the other two. Oh, 27. I think the Wind Rider Yasuos together will account for a bit more of the value, but really that's like your core game plan, so I wouldn't play this deck without those at all. But this is sort of what the combo style currently looks like, and I'm sure there will be other combo cards to work with. And I mean, there are other decks to check out, either my own, which are incredibly flawed, and like I'm experimenting a lot, so I wouldn't recommend these for most people, really. And then the public deck library, a lot of like very good tournament ranked decks that are like floating around if you're really just looking for that. The Piltover archive team is also like pretty good at putting stuff up and keeping track of the tournaments. So that's kind of what I would recommend as like an approach to thinking through deck construction. Really think through your deck holistically, what speed you want to play, what game plan you're pushing towards, and what pieces are going to protect or advance that game plan as much as possible. Obviously, a lot of these decks are going to require fine tuning, and the meta will continue to evolve until the new set comes out. And we are about 1 month from the Chinese release of Spirit Forged, which will see 12 new champions release, along with new cards for all of these colors. So all the decks are going to change. The meta is going to shift almost assuredly, and there will be new champions that will become dominant. So Kai'Sa's on top for now, as is Yi, and I think that's because their abilities are quite strong and reliable to use compared to some of the other ones. R.I.P. Leona for now. But I think, especially if you're just getting into the game, if you're playing with friends and you're trying to figure out how to build for yourself, and if you're trying to go to Nexus Nights or even smaller, more casual local events, I'm in Canada, so they're not that big for the most part. You can find success arguably with every hero except for Garen, would be my inkling. And even then, you can probably make it work if you just brute force it with a lot of cards. I just think it's going to be a lot more expensive to make that deck work. So if you're still around, thank you for checking this video out. This was really spurred by the community, and if response is good, I'll probably keep making some more of these to think through how to construct decks and how to analyze the game, both from a casual, an academic, and a more competitive standpoint. And yeah, I hope you liked it.